Hello, hello, hello. Look at this. This is amazing. Still seating people. It does not get better than that. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. We really appreciate it. My name is Kenya Young, and I am the Senior Vice President of Programming here at New York Public Radio and WNYC. I want to thank you and welcome you to the Jerome L. Greene Performance Space here. This is a beautiful night outside, but also inside. It warms my heart when we're able to see and get people out, so thank you so much. Tonight marks our second collaboration with the Tenement Museum. We're delighted to partner with this remarkable institution that, like WNYC, is dedicated to telling human stories, stories that connect our past to our present. Both of our organizations, I'm glad to say, share a commitment to educating and inspiring our audiences to the world around us. And what I really love about this collaboration is how we bring history to life through authentic storytelling. Here at WNYC is hope on how we might move forward together. So back in February, we had our first production together, which explored the passing of the 15th Amendment and its impact right here in New York City. Hopefully you either out here for that one or heard about that one. Right here in New York City and right here actually in this very neighborhood. So tonight we continue the tradition of this history telling on this significant anniversary as we turn our attention to the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire of 1911. In a few moments, our talented, it says the talented, but our talented and insightful Amina Srna, producer and guest host of The Brian Lehrer Show, will guide us through this evening's program. But first, I'd like to express extreme gratitude to the Steinway Foundation for this beautiful piano on our stage. We love the piano, and we're so grateful for it. And welcome to the stage, Tony Award-winning Shaina Taub, thank you, the creator of the Broadway hit musical, Suffs.
You won't live to see the future that you fight for. Maybe no one gets to reach that perfect day. If the work is never over, and how do you keep marching anyway? Do you carry your banner as far as you can, rewriting the world with your imperfect pen, till the next stubborn girl picks it up in a picket line over and over again, and you join in the chorus of centuries chanting to her? The path will be twisted and risky and slow, but keep marching, keep marching. Will you fail or prevail? Well, you may never know, but keep marching, 'cause your ancestors are all the proof you need that progress is possible, not guaranteed. Keep marching on. Keep marching on. Keep marching on. And remember every mother that you came from. Learn as much from our success as our mistakes. Don't forget you're merely one of many others on the journey every generation makes. We did not end in justice, and neither will you. But still we made strides, so we know you can too. Make peace with our incomplete power and use it for good, 'cause there's so much to do. The gains will feel small and the losses too large. Keep marching, keep marching. You'll rarely agree with whoever's in charge. Keep marching, 'cause your ancestors are all the proof you need that progress is possible, not guaranteed. It will only be made if we keep marching on. Keep marching on. now. The future demands that we fight for it now. It will only be ours if we keep marching on. Come on, keep marching, marching, marching. 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 Keep marching on. Thank you so much. Welcome. Wow, Shaina Taub, one more time. Thank you so much. Good evening and welcome. I'm Amina, Srna, a longtime producer here at WNYC. As Kenya mentioned, this discussion is part of a partnership between our station and the Tenement Museum. We're calling this latest installation The Triangle Fire, Response, Reform, and Reverberations. Today, March 25th, marks the 114th anniversary of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. Happened right here in New York City, just a few blocks from where we're all seated. And you may remember learning about it, maybe even vaguely, back in 7th and 8th grade social studies class. The aftermath of the fire brought about some of the worker protections that we may take for granted today. Think Social Security, a 40-hour work week, unemployment insurance, and the list really goes on. But what's rarely told is the story of the women behind the movement. It was a movement that took shape across cultural and class divides. To help walk us through that history and the contributions made by so many immigrant women workers, even up to the 1980s, we're joined this evening by Annie Polland, president of the Tenement Museum. Annelise Orleck, historian at Dartmouth and author of several books, including Common Sense and a Little Fire, Women and Working Class Politics in the United States, and most recently, We Are All Fast Food Workers Now. And Margaret Chin, professor and chair of sociology at CUNY Hunter College and author of Sewing Women, Immigrants, and the New York City Garment Industry. Shaina Taub, of course, is the creator of the hit Broadway show, Suffs. And this evening, she will bring us some of the stories of the women involved in this movement in their own words. So Annie, Annelise, Margaret, and Shaina, thank you all for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.
And before we get started, just a quick programming note. We will wrap up this evening by turning over the questions to you, the audience, for a Q&A session. So stay tuned for that. Annelise, we just heard Keep Marching On. That play tells the story of the women's suffrage movement here in the United States. Want to give us a bit of context about what we just heard and the role that women were carving out for themselves?
By the early 20th century, the suffrage movement had been going on for more than almost 70 years, and it was getting a little tired. It was given a jolt of electricity when the Pankhursts came from Britain and toured the United States and tried to get people involved in civil disobedience and, you know, all the kind of direct action that suffragists were taking in Britain. But what really gave it a jolt of electricity is when working women became involved. And Rose Schneiderman, whose picture is up there, 4'11" cap maker from Poland, red-haired firebrand known as the Red Rose of Anarchy, became one of the favorite speakers of Carrie Chapman's Cat's Equality League of Wage-Earning Women. And Clara Lemlich helped to form something called the Wage Earners Suffrage League. And what they said they were doing is counterposing the common sense of working women to the sentimentality of New York senators, right? They wanted to talk about, as Rose Schneiderman said, you're not going to lose your femininity anymore by putting a ballot in a box once a year than you do from, having your hand in harsh chemicals in a laundry, right? Or working, on a loom. So they changed the discourse of the suffrage movement. They made it a working class issue. They brought in their husbands because, again, the suffrage movement, you had to have men vote for it, or the suffrage amendment wouldn't pass. So I think the involvement of working women was really a profound turning point.
The fire took place in 1911, but before we get there, let's spend a little time on what happened leading up to it. Just around the turn of the 20th century, the garment industry in New York City absolutely exploded. Annie or Annelise, can you tell us more about just how massive that industry was here?
Yeah, the garment industry has always been incredibly important to New York, starting in the 19th century and growing with each decade, really. By the turn of the 20th century, you have a lot of conditions that help the garment industry grow. You have cheap labor coming over from Europe, Eastern Europe, and Southern Europe, and Italy, and Russia, Poland. You also have the other thing about New York that's so important to understand the garment industry is that you don't have space for other kinds of industries or other kinds of manufacturing. Mm-hmm. So garment production can happen in tenements. And if you come to a little tenement on Orchard Street, you can see in practically every room a sewing machine, right? Because every immigrant group, every migrant group who came to New York really through the 1980s worked in the garment industry or had members of their group working in the garment industry. But in 1900, you have this growth because you also have the growth of ready-made clothing, right? The idea that you could go to a department store and buy an outfit, and their standardized sizing. And so that enabled this growth of the industry in the late 19th century, and then it keeps growing and growing. And what was particularly popular in the 1900s is this idea of the shirtwaist, and a shirtwaist is basically a blouse. And so a lot of these women, East European Jewish girls and Italian girls, are working in garment shops, and they're doing so in order to raise money for their families. Their families depend on this income. But what they're also doing is, what we say to everyone, or what I say to everyone who comes on one of the garment tours, is that no matter where you're from in this room, people could be from St. Louis, they could be from California, they would have had garments back then that were through railroads coming from the tenement districts. New York was making 70% of women's clothing by 1910. So the garment industry is just growing, and it's pulling in all of these workers.
I wasn't going to ask this, but since you bring up the shirtwaists, they are, in my reading, I came across that they were actually intentionally styled to be a little bit more modeling men's shirts.
Yeah,
at the
the
time.
idea was if you're rather than wearing a dress with all these corsets and things like that, you're wearing a shirt and a skirt. It was sporty, right? So it was and a tie also, right? So there was this, absolutely. But the irony of it is that these girls are stuck behind these sewing machines, sewing the symbol of a carefree life that was not theirs.
They didn't have, that brings us to the first character in our story this evening, Clara Lemlich. Shaina, will you do us the honors? Here's Shaina reading an excerpt from Lemlich on this comes from November 22nd, 1909.
I am a working girl, one of those who are on strike against intolerable conditions. I am tired of listening to speakers who talk in general terms. What we are here for is to decide whether we shall or shall not strike. I offer a resolution that a general strike be declared now. I said I offer a resolution that a general strike be declared now.
Annelise, you want to kind of give your reactions here? What happened to stellar speech? What happened after Lemlich's speech?
What happened after Lemlich's speech is that while those garment workers couldn't afford the clothes they were making, they did make clothes that looked very much like the ones that were being sold in the store. And so perhaps the thing they were most proud of were those big hats. And so they threw their hats in the air after Clara called on the crowd to affirm a strike. And they didn't know how many people would walk off the job the next day. But before the strike ended in February and March of 1910, they involved between 20 and 40,000 workers in New York alone. It was a general strike that could be found on all of the corners in this neighborhood and throughout Lower Manhattan, and it spread. We'll come back to the Triangle Fire, which happens, in 1911, but it spread across the country, and I think that's a really important fact. Right, so that these young girls all across the country, it spread to Boston, to Cleveland, to Chicago, to Kalamazoo, Michigan, to Philadelphia, and all of these young garment workers went on strike. So it was an electric moment called a girls' uprising, and the socialist paper said the New York Call said they calmly walked away from the one thing standing between their families and starvation. Wow.
Annie, as we were just hearing, 20,000 people took to the streets. Was this a strike just of the working class, or were there other people involved?
Well, the women working in the garment shops were working class, of course. But what had also happened as part of this growth in the women's movement and suffrage, in 1904, the Women's Trade Union League formed. And these were well-off women, middle class, upper, some of them, Elva Belmont or Anne Morgan, like the richest women in the city. And they were interested in suffrage primarily, women getting the right to vote. But they realized that these other women are more concerned with their day-to-day. Crazy them. And so the women, the suffrage women realized, we need to kind of form an allyship, an alliance with these working class women. And so the Women's Trade Union League was formed to help these women in their pursuits, economic pursuits, and kind of bring them in to this larger cause for women. So these women, when the strike happened, went out on strike, and it was a cold winter. And so they were called by the journalists, called them the mink brigades, because you'd have these women in minks. And it was important because at that time, police were arresting these women. I mean, Clara Lemlich, before she gave that speech, just I think 2 months or so before that speech, or 10 weeks before that speech, had her ribs broken because factory owners were hiring gangsters basically to come and beat these people up, to intimidate them. And so the police and the judges were more on the side of the factory owners for the most part. And so these women, the working class women, were alone except for these upper class women coming. And not only would they be out, and it would make it harder for the police to arrest some of the women because not all of them had mink, so you didn't want to arrest a socialite. And then the women would also go to the courtrooms and watch these women, the judges sentence them and, bail them out and also speak on their behalf. So it really, I think, brought even more attention to what was happening. So this kind of interesting cross-class alliance is happening.
Margaret, in your book, Sewing Women, you write about workers later on in the century, mostly Chinese American and Korean American workers in the garment industry here in New York City. Can you talk about the lessons from this moment and the influence for later union workers?
Yeah, definitely. So the workers that I interviewed, especially the Chinese women, they were all members of the union and really wanted to be a member of the ILGWU. And because the union was what we called a social union, that meant that they had clubs for them to learn English. That meant that they had trips for them to go to Bear Mountain. It also meant that they had, a dental office, a children's daycare center, all these different things. So when women went to these activities, they learned about the strike. And for my mom, especially, she was a garment worker in Europe. She knew about the fire that we'll talk about later. So in many ways, they learned a little bit about the history, less so about what a union did, but more about what women could do in the history of garment work.
And so interesting, too, because as we talk about the 1910s and then later on in the 1980s, there are women organizing, and in a lot of cases, they're not speaking a common language. I think Clara Lemlich was giving speeches on street corners in Yiddish, and later on, we see Chinese Americans spreading the gospel of unions later on. So pretty fascinating that they could join forces and take care of each other in that way.
Yeah, definitely. Inspired to go out in the street. You'll see later.
Well, one of the things these women did is they made sure to have organizers who spoke all of the languages, right? I think both in the 1982 strike and in the 1909 strike.
This brings us to the fire itself. From what I've read, it started in a waste basket on the 8th floor of that building, and the flames then jumped up onto the paper patterns that were hanging from the ceiling. Fires in factories at that time were not uncommon. A few months prior to that, there was a massive fire at a similar factory in New Jersey. But this fire turned deadly and very quickly. In a span of roughly 30 minutes, 146 workers lost their lives, mostly girls and young women. Annelise, why was this fire so deadly?
Well, those shirtwaists were often made of grass linen, and grass linen was unbelievably flammable. And one of the things, and so the fire burned so hot that there were skeletons found at sewing machines.
Wow.
Right? People were just burned to death immediately. Most people who died did not die like that. They, passed out through smoke inhalation, and or they they jumped off the fire escape onto the street below. But I think the deadliness of it was also because the doors were locked to prevent them supposedly from stealing fabric. There's a Zito, who was the elevator operator, really was heroic in getting up and down for as long as he could and to try to get people saved. And it's worth noting that there were something like 800 workers, and so most of them were ultimately saved. But the deadliness of it, for those on the 8th floor, was such that it would change the country. I know we'll talk about that more later, but Frances Perkins, whose picture is up there, lived around the corner. She was then a social worker, worked for the National Consumers League, and she watched the fire burn and vowed, that she would spend the rest of her life, fighting to try to make sure that there was not another fire like this. But just imagine a warm spring day, right? It's March. It's just like today, and people are all out watching these young girls fall to their deaths or jump to their deaths right near Washington Square Park. So, it was a horrific event, and an event that took place in the media capital, right? New York was then, as it is still, the media capital of the country, and so the word spread around the world very quickly.
And Frances Perkins, I think, was just having tea. She was on, at Washington Square Park. There were still, wealthy people that lived on that northern block, the right north of the square. So she was having tea. So just, to be having tea and then to hear the fire alarms and to come out and see this. So I think it was important that the fire was where it was, as opposed to being on Orchard Street, for example, right? So
Why is that?
Because of all these people seeing it.
And people seeing it, I think you phrased this on the Brian Lehrer Show interview, people of different walks of life, of different classes, it was just kind of right in that corner where a lot of these lives were intersecting.
Just one more thought, too, that for the firemen and the police who came and carried out the bodies, but also tried to rescue the women, they recognized them because they had arrested them, a year or so earlier. So they weren't nameless victims; they were fighters, right? And the city had come to be attached to these women in the course of the general strike.
Thanks for adding that. So before we get to Frances Perkins, we have one more character in this story. Just 1 week after the Triangle Fire, on April 2nd, 1911, the Women's Trade Union League sponsored one of the largest post-fire meetings at the Metropolitan Opera House. And the crowd was incredibly galvanized by an organizer and former garment worker, Rose Schneiderman. Here's Shaina Taub again with an excerpt from Schneiderman's speech, again, April 2nd, 1911.
I would be a traitor to these poor burned bodies if I came here to talk good fellowship. We have tried, you good people of the public, and we have found you wanting. The old Inquisition had its rack and its thumb screws and its instruments of torture with iron teeth. We know what these things are today. The iron teeth are our necessities. The thumb screws are the high-powered and swift machinery close to which we must work. And the rack is here, in the fire trap structures that will destroy us the minute they catch on fire. This is not the first time girls have been burned alive in the city. Every week, I must learn of the untimely death of one of my sister workers. Every year, thousands of us are maimed. The life of men and women is so cheap, and property is so sacred. There are so many of us for one job, it matters little if 146 of us are burned to death. We have tried you, citizens. We are trying you now. And you have a couple of dollars for the sorrowing mothers, brothers, and sisters by way of a charity gift. But every time the workers come out in the only way they know to protest against conditions which are unbearable, the strong hand of the law is allowed to press down heavily upon us. Public officials have only words of warning to us, warning that we must be intensely peaceable. And they have the workhouse just back of all their warnings. The strong hand of the law beats us back when we rise into the conditions that make life unbearable. I can't talk fellowship to you who are gathered here. Too much blood has been spilled. I know from my experience, it is up to the working people to save themselves. The only way they can save themselves is by a strong working class movement.
Wow. Who wants to take this one? I mean, what were you thinking? So riveting.
Well, I mean, I think, and Annelise will have many things to say about this too, but I think what struck me listening to this is that you're thinking about Rose herself, who had been working with the Women's Trade Union League also. And these women were caught in a real tension. Because as your amazing book shows, that, you know, on the one hand, from a class perspective, they were so allied with the ILG, the leaders of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, who were fighting for all of this change. But as women, they were held back. They were held back from leadership positions. There was only so far they could go. From another perspective, with the Women's Trade Union League, these women didn't always understand their class needs. They didn't understand socialism. And so that was always a tension. And so it's like almost like in hearing Shaina read it so beautifully, I heard something else, which is just even Rose's, not just her anger, but like maybe her own inner tension, inner conflict about having been part of this and trying to figure out how to move forward. What is the best way to move forward? And of course, just the utter frustration with what had just happened days before the speech happened. And the irony, though, not the irony, but the interesting thing is, in the wake of this fire, in the wake of this speech, perhaps, what creates change is a cross-class alliance. It isn't just the working class. The working class is incredibly important, but it's because politicians, sometimes with their own motivations, you know, Al Smith and Robert Wagner were incredibly important in having this happen, because they basically, what happens right after this speech is that there's a committee of safety formed, and Frances Perkins is invited to be part of it, as are others, and they start to, you know, do stuff, and I think Al Smith says, you should do this legislatively, like, we'll have a committee as part of the Assembly and part of the State Senate, and that will give you legislative power to make change. And that then gave birth to the Factory Investigation Commission or Committee with Frances Perkins and Clara Lemlich as a worker, and a host of people from a variety of backgrounds. And it's that combination of the working class and also professionals, doctors. You know, this is the progressive movement, so everyone's knowledge and specialty kind of comes into play. So amazing things come out of that speech, but also out of everyone reacting to the speech and what had happened.
I think the speech exemplifies that moment in that all of these young women workers, the came forward and got a voice, right? And Rose Schneiderman's voice was the most notable. You can get a sense of what an incredibly powerful speaker she was. But the coverage of the strike is really interesting because it calls it a leaderless movement and says one girl after another comes up and begins to speak, in these really indelible ways. And so they follow that when they get politicians involved. And so Pauline Newman, Rose Schneiderman's fellow Women's Trade Union League organizer and someone who worked in the Triangle Factory and who lost friends in the fire, made sure that Al Smith went to the homes of every family who lost a daughter or a son. There were a few boys. And they would later say that the mission, right, the passion with which they pursued legislation afterwards came from literally sitting at the kitchen table of these grieving parents.
Yeah, can I just add something? If you move forward, to the 1980s, the women also, the Chinese women in particular, because they had a strike later on, but they also felt that too, that organizing moment, the moment when somebody said, we have to fight for ourselves too, as part of the working class, and kind of just realizing exactly what the young women in, 1909 felt, and afterwards, right? That's what they felt too. And I think a lot of people don't realize that, and the women that you'll see later on are actually older than these young girls.
Yes.
But, they're out there doing the same thing when they realize that they actually have a voice. And that's a part of it. They have a voice inside the union that they actually never thought they had.
We have already previewed Frances Perkins a little bit, but I just want to give her bio because she is very cool. She was very, very cool. She was the first female cabinet member as Secretary of Labor in the Roosevelt administration. She held that post for 12 years. That's longer than any other Secretary of Labor has ever served since. And we talked about how her activism and political career was really galvanized when she witnessed firsthand what was happening at the Triangle Fire. Annie, you have already mentioned the factory investigation committee that kind of was born out of this moment, and worth noting, it happened so quickly. I mean, if the fire was in March, by August, this committee was formed. Years later, Perkins termed the investigation as a turning point in American attitudes towards social responsibility. And in the course of our research for tonight, we found some audio of Perkins in WNYC's very own archives. So we're going to play it for you now. This is Perkins speaking at the 50th anniversary event of the fire.
And if I may say so at this time, the stirring up of the public conscience and the act of the people in penitence brought about not only these laws, which make still to this day, and we had in the election of Franklin Roosevelt the beginning of what has come to be called a New Deal. New for the United States, but based really upon the experience that we had had in New York State and upon those who died on March 25th, 1911 in this great fire. For this we can be thankful, and we can still say these dead have not died in vain, and we will never forget them.
So Annie, what were some of those state regulations that she was talking about, or maybe you want to reflect on how they were a model for the rest of the country?
Yeah, I mean, the Factory Investigation Commission would not have happened in an era where people work from home. Let's just say that. Like, they went to like hundreds of factories throughout the state. They widened it, so it wasn't just looking at garment shops. It was any kind of factory, candy making factories, all sorts of like factories with chemicals and all sorts of horrible things that they were able to document, get witnesses, testify, and go to court. And they passed dozens of laws, again, that changed the state. And because New York State became a leader in this, and Frances Perkins would go on to become basically a labor leader in New York State when FDR becomes governor of New York. And then she would bring, all the Northeast states together for conferences and share these laws and all of that. So that kind of passed. And when FDR was elected, and Margaret and I were just at the Roosevelt House, we were in the library where FDR would he met with Frances Perkins. This was just a week ago. Not that he met with him, that Margaret and I were in the room. And he said, would you serve as my Secretary of Labor? And she says, okay, I will, but these are the things I want to get done. A 40-hour work week, Social Security, unemployment insurance, minimum wage, all sorts of things. And she also said universal health care. And the only thing I think that didn't happen was universal health care. But she was recognized by FDR and all of these leaders. They all were in awe of her and her work. I mean, she was tireless, and she rolled up her sleeves. She went into those factories, and then she also got Robert Wagner and Al Smith to go into the factories as well, and everyone had to see these conditions. And so this real activism in every sense of the word.
I haven't independently verified this, but a Brian Lair Show listener told us that whenever Roosevelt got a question regarding the New Deal, he would just wave people away and say, ask Frances, go ask her. Annelise, in your book, Common Sense and a Little Fire, we get a glimpse of these close relationships, not only between Perkins and Roosevelt, but also Schneiderman. So can you talk a little bit about how these sort of influential relationships between somebody working class like Schneiderman and rising politicians like Roosevelt, how did they meet? How did they rub shoulders?
Well,
I think the same things are happening now.
the cross-class collaboration shifted a little bit in the 20s when a young political wife by the name of Eleanor Roosevelt became the single most important financial backer and political backer of the Women's Trade Union League for the rest of its existence into the 50s. And when Franklin was recovering from polio, he was bored, and she brought people to visit him, including people who made her mother-in-law furious, Jewish socialists like Rose Schneiderman and Pauline Newman, but also other figures, coal miners. Perkins would later say in The Roosevelt I Knew, the reason that Franklin Roosevelt seemed to have touch with the experience of the working class is because he engaged in those deep conversations. And he would appoint Rose Schneiderman as the only woman on the National Labor Advisory Board, which was figuring out the codes for the New Deal and wage and hour regulations nationally in different industries. So it was kind of remarkable for this, this Polish immigrant cap maker to be in Washington. And when I teach about the New Deal, I always talk about, there's a chapter in my book called Imagine Me, Fagala Shapiro, Sleeping in Lincoln's Bed. Because Eleanor, when there was a Women's Trade Union League conference, she would invite them to D.C. and said, sleep at the White House. And so Fagala Shapiro really did sleep in Lincoln's bed. And that became kind of symbolic. I mean, some of the changes of the Roosevelt administration were just symbolic, but the symbolism mattered. And, a sense of the White House as the people's house really mattered. Supposedly, Franklin came down in his bathrobe to greet them when they slept in the White House and said, the refrigerator in here, here's the kitchen. If you want to come down for a snack in the middle of the night, feel free. So, the mom and pop presidency was very effective.
That's so cool. Margaret, your book, Sewing Women, you write about how the face of the garment industry changed as immigration laws in this country changed. So it's a long history, but do you want to kind of give us some spark notes and take us through that briefly?
Yeah, sure. I can give you some spark notes. So I think I have to start in the 1940s. So in the 1940s, there were Chinese men who fought in World War II, and they were actually American-born Chinese men. And actually, even before that, there was the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, where Chinese couldn't immigrate to this country, and later on, no Asians could immigrate to this country. But here in Chinatown, what happened was that there were some Chinese men who fought in World War II, and they came back into town, and during that time after the 1940s, they were finally allowed to bring wives over as war brides, because during that time, there were 6 Chinese men for every Chinese woman. So when they started bringing back home, war brides, they needed to find a place for them to work and to settle down. So many of them lived in Chinatown and the Lower East Side. And the best thing they could do was to turn and look at their Jewish neighbors and saw that some of them actually owned garment shops. So in the late 1960s, there were like 20 or so garment shops before the change in the immigration laws. But they chose garment shops because, you know, you've heard about Chinese laundries, right? But during the 1940s, washing machines were the hottest thing. So they didn't want to go into the laundry business because they weren't going to do well. So anyway, so they opened up garment shops, and that was a way for their wives to work in, and also for other women coming into the city for them to find a job. So by the time of the 1965 immigration law, where they started bringing in more Asians could come in, the population of New York City grew. And shortly after 1965, the number of garment shops grew to 60 to 100. By the time of 1979, close to 60% of the Chinatown area that we know today, the families were associated with garment factories. So many of the women down there just worked in garment factories. So that's a little snippet of what happened. But the 1965 immigration law, where you were allowed to bring family members here, that was the key where immigration changed for the Asian American families, especially Chinese Americans. It's totally unexpected, but they were allowed to bring let's say, their siblings over, their parents over, and so that's how they ended up in New York City.
And the garment industry had been declining for a host of reasons after World War II, but the arrival of all these Chinese immigrants and all these factors actually led to a little bit, it started to go up again.
Margaret, you took us through very quickly, thank you. But can you tell us what happened? We talked about the 60s, we've talked about the 70s briefly. Can you tell us what happened in 1982?
Yes. So by that time, if you can imagine, the community is a lot bigger now. The community, when I first described it in 1940, it was just, if you know New York City, it was just Pell, Mott, and Dwyer Street. By the time 1965 rolls around, you've hit Mott Street. By the time 1980s roll around, or 79, you've also gone into Little Italy by that time. If you guys know the area, past up Mulberry Street, up and down Mulberry Street, past, so I think, Broome Street, I think, at that point, and you start moving to the Lower East Side, almost close to past Allen Street, close to Orchard Street, in fact. So now New York City, Chinatown is humongous. And if you think about it, we also have garment shops that are located all over the place down there. And so garment workers now at this time are about 20,000 or 40,000, 20 to 40,000 garment workers are down there now, with over 400 shops. At the height of the garment industry in the late 1980s, you have 400 shops. But what we're going to talk about is 1982. In 1982, with all of these women working in the garment shops, in fact, June 24th, 1982, many of the women working there actually knew about the union. They didn't know exactly what the union did, but the business agents spoke Chinese to them. And because it was such a time where you had manufacturers and contractors going overseas, a lot of the work, garment sewing, was lost. And people were fearful that they were going to lose their jobs. But because of the union and because of the work that they could do, the Chinese garment workers try to retain their jobs inside of New York City. So during 1982, one of the first things that happened was that many of the women who worked there, and the interviews showed that, you know, if we were going to lose our union, it would be a very bad thing. If we were going to lose our union contract for the workers, it meant that they were going to lose their health benefits. For some of the older women, as you can see, a lot of the women by that time were older. They were going to lose their retirement benefits. What's going to happen after that? So for these garment workers who basically had a history of working in the garment industry for 10, 15, sometimes 20 years now, the garment union was what they wanted. Let me backtrack one more minute. So when these women first joined the garment union, what they knew was they wanted to get health insurance, something that they couldn't get elsewhere. So that's the main reason why they joined the garment union. And at that time, in 1982, because the garment workers were so embedded in the community, when they went out on strike, and they did go on strike because a lot of their contractors did not want to sign the union contract, because the union contractors basically said, you know what, I can hire people. And at that time, by 1982, computerization was starting to come around. They could send some of their work overseas too. A lot of the manufacturers would say that. We can actually send our work down to the South as well and hire people there. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see that this was never shown in the New York Times. People didn't talk about it at all. So a lot of these workers, they felt like Rose Schneiderman did. They felt like Clara Lemlich did, that they can actually take a stand to stand up for themselves. They actually thought, well, hey, you know, I've been working in the garment industry for a long time now. I've been the one bringing health insurance into my family. I've been the one working so that I could bring other family members here, because when you work for the garment union, you're actually working for a paycheck. And when you show that paycheck, you can actually sponsor your family members to come over as well. So when you look at these pictures, it's pretty amazing how they organize these workers to come out. And so it ended up from the stories from the workers is they spent evenings going to people's homes, organizing people, basically saying, hey, you know what? If we don't go out and strike, we're never going to be able to get our union contract signed. So they went to each other's homes to basically sign up people to go out and speak out. And a couple of the speeches that day were actually really inspiring. One person talked about, especially Srna Ka, she spoke about how we actually have to go there because our contractors really just treat us like if we're grasshoppers. But we have to go out there like a truck to mow them over, mow those grasshoppers over, is what she said. This is Mrs. Ka right there. And she also said during that time that, you know, we have to unite as workers too, because we're the workers, even though our garment factory owners are also Chinese, the manufacturers really thought that we would just go with them. We would not sign a contract because they're Chinese as well. But instead, she said, but we're workers. We have to remember we're workers. We're always workers, and we're going to stand up for them. And her speech at this strike, she also said, look, when one flower blooms, when one worker comes out and blooms, it's not enough. It only works if every single flower blooms. That's when we'll get spring, and that's when we'll win the strike. So that's Mrs. Ka.
Beautiful.
That's beautiful. As Margaret was saying, Annelise, the garment industry has since moved out of New York City in large part. You profile some of these workers in your latest book, We Are All Fast Food Workers Now. Can you tell us about who you've met?
Yeah, I collaborated on that book with my good friend, the photographer Elizabeth Cook, who's here. These are her photographs. Actually, the one in the middle are the two women at the top are Walmart workers, but everybody else are garment workers from Bangladesh and Cambodia. At that time, Bangladesh was the second largest clothing maker in the world. So when Kalpana Akhtar, who's there with the bindi, when she came to Cooper Union on an earlier anniversary of Triangle, she had people look at the labels on their shirts because she knew that people would find that many people in the audience were wearing clothes that were made in Bangladesh. Now, clothes are made not just in Bangladesh and Cambodia, but those are places where there have been tremendous militants. And there's militants, hundreds of thousands of women marching in Bangladesh even as we speak, right? The movement is incredibly militant, and fire is one of the major issues. The worst disaster in the history of the garment industry was not the Triangle Fire. It was the Rana Plaza building collapse in 2013, and it killed 10 times the number of people who died in Triangle. So they take inspiration from the Triangle fire and what came afterwards, what we've been talking about. And they say, Calpona told Liz and me that when they organize around Triangle, it's a turning point, right, for them, and so it gives them hope that can happen in Bangladesh too. A quick comment about the two women up there with their fists. Vunem and Tarat Sok organized a sisterhood alliance in Cambodia of garment workers, and they do amazing things, including under a dictatorship in which protest was illegal. They created two things: a band called Messenger Band, all of whose lyrics are the words of garment workers describing their own stories. And when they would be arrested, Vunem, who is the lead singer, would say, tell the police, I'm just singing. We're just a band, right? We're not doing anything. Tarat Sok organized a fashion show. And the fashion show they would wear the clothes that they made but that they couldn't afford to buy, but then they would carry out the annual income of Phil Knight of Nike and the Waltons, and all of the billionaires who've profited from the clothes they make. So it's a remarkable movement. They also helped women with birth control, and with suing runaway shops, runaway landlords, which is a big problem. The shop owner will just close instead of giving them their union rights. So there's a remarkably vibrant labor movement around the world. Women's issues are very much on the front burner. Pregnancy discrimination, wage gaps, all of that have been really important in their organizing. So in the new edition of Common Sense and a Little Fire, which I think is what's here, I tell their story a little bit in the introduction. And, I think they're Rose and Pauline and Clara would be really enjoying these young firebrands.
That's incredible. So we've been talking about the protections that all of these women throughout history have gained for themselves, and by that extension for all other workers. And today, as we sit in the Greene space, I think it's fair to acknowledge that many of those federal safety nets are under threat. I know you're not journalists. I know you're historians. But do you want to comment on this present moment that we find ourselves in? I'm thinking especially about the Perkins clip that we heard, and her saying, quote, "These dead have not died in vain." So where are we today?
There's just like so much humanity. I mean, the idea that one of the things Frances Perkins says also in that speech is that was an awakening, and this awakening of the public conscience, not just for workers' rights, but to understand the humanity of our fellow brothers and sisters. And I think those words are so important today, wherever you stand, right? Like, how are you connected one to another? And one of the kind of, textbook progressive era definitions is, one component of it is a social cohesion, like this idea that we are responsible one for the other. And I think that is very important for us to think about today, thinking about what's the city that we want to build, what's the nation we want to build. Another part of the progressive era was also knowledge is important. And again, nothing would have been done in that Factory Investigation Commission if work and research wasn't done, and trusting in ideas and theories. And so people with expertise, that's important. Another part of it is that the role of the federal government, like that the government is there. This was the Factory Investigation Commission was the beginning of this concept of the welfare state, the idea that the state has a responsibility as well. So I would love to see a world that we can all build together wherever we're sitting that lifts up this idea of working one for another.
Yeah, can I add? Because I think that's really important. And I also think that if you look at the pictures and you look around New York City, like the kind of humanity here in New York City is a multiracial humanity. And I think people across all different races, all ethnic groups, also share everything that Frances Perkins said, on all of her beliefs, and also we have to think about it in that way too, that we are a new, it's now 100 years later, and we have to think about it that way.
But 100 years later, we have to think about
Yes.
redoing what they did and,
Yes.
and saving, the cornerstones of the welfare state. The Social Security is under threat, we know, as a result of DOGE. The National Labor Relations Act is going to go before the Supreme Court. It's already a case that's happening. So the right to unionize, the Fair Labor Standards Act, right? The people who gave you the weekend. The Fair Labor Standards Act is under threat. So, I don't know if you have to reinvent the wheel or rebuild the welfare state every 100 years, but I tell my students that, this may be their job. I don't know what's going to be left in a few years, but remembering the spirit in which it was built and the tragedies that gave rise to it, I think are really important as we go out and fight to save it, because that is what we're going to have to do, or it will be gone.
And so I think that's why Shaina's song, "The Keep Marching," is so important. And the Keep Marching song is not about like, it's all fun, let's go to a parade and it's easy. It's like the words. I don't want to murder the words, but like. But and that the stories of our ancestors is important, and that's what and progress is possible, not guaranteed, right? That's to keep marching, to keep going, and to keep going with an understanding of where we've come.
Beautifully put. We're going to open up to some questions from you, the audience. I'll flag that there are a few mics going around, so feel free to raise your hand. Somebody will run over to you. And if you've got a question, we'll take them.
This is for Annelise. My students are reading your book, and they love it, and they're particularly interested in the concept of industrial feminism. I wonder if you could say a word or two about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think to this day, most people think of feminism as a middle-class white project, and a lot of my career has been devoted to trying to, dispel that myth. And I think for these young women in the early 20th century, they were meeting those wealthy women who were bailing them out and, making suffrage speeches on the courthouse steps of the Jefferson Market, courthouse on 6th and 8th. And they realized they had their own vision, right? And their own vision was a vision of feminism that was totally infused with class, and ultimately with multiculturalism and multi-ethnic solidarity. That's, it was in that spirit that they also made sure there was someone from every community who spoke every language who was themselves functioning as an organizer. So that union really also, it's industrial feminism, and then that gave rise really to the concept of multicultural politics. And there's a great book by Dan Katz called Altogether Different, which talks about the 1930s and the ILG and the way in which they promoted all the cultures and languages of the people in the movement.
Next. We have one from the chat, which was asking about what is the current status of the garment industry in New York City today?
Yeah, sure. I can answer that. So it's hard pressed to find maybe 20 shops in New York City right now. So what happened was that huge crowd that you saw, there were over 400 shops right before. I'd say it's slowly declining, but still about 400 shops, 20,000 workers, even in 2001. So 9/11 was the death knell to the garment industry. And if you recall, all of the shops were down in that area. There's some in Midtown, but what happened was when the towers came down, all the streets were shut down and no cloth could come in to lower Manhattan or even into Midtown Manhattan. No cloth could come in and no work could go out and no workers can actually get into their factories to actually sew. And in Chinatown, the whole area had no electricity or telephone service until Christmas time of that year, from 9/11 till Christmas time. So what do you do when your president at that time, George Bush, tells you to be patriotic, you should go shop and buy your holiday clothing, right? So in September of the year, usually the season goes that you're going to sew holiday clothes. So in September, all that holiday clothing, cloth was left on the tables. And what the manufacturers did was they sent their stuff overseas. And once they sent their stuff overseas, they found cheaper labor, and it stayed there. So what New York was good for was quick time labor. A garment was good, it was selling well, you would make it down in Manhattan somewhere, in Chinatown or Midtown Manhattan. They could no longer do that. And so they just shipped it away. And it never came back because they could never, make money here again after that.
Question in the front.
Thank you very much. What was the role of media, specifically newspapers and then later radio and then television in the 20th century in terms of either endorsing or maybe hampering reform?
Well, it's interesting. The Mink Brigade stopped people from getting beaten up, but they also changed the way the New York Times covered the strikes. The New York Times was very, very scathing about the strikers, and there were all kinds of questions raised about their morality. When the wealthy women came out, that started to change. I think the media played a huge role in publicizing the Triangle Fire. There's a raft, if you go to the Keel Center at Cornell, amazing political cartoons that ran in newspapers in the city, of which there were many in those days, and then all across the country condemning the greed of the Triangle owners. But the women were also, when the trial came and they were trying to get some compensation for the families of those who died, there was a lot of stereotyping that also took place of the young women, and so the media has to own that as well. I don't know, in the Chinatown Strike.
Yeah, the Chinatown Strike, it's really hard to find any coverage of it. Like the pictures that we have here are from actual people who were actually there, and from the NYU Center, I think on Labor Center. The New York Times did not cover it at all. So when you talk about media, it's hidden. And also, I think at the time, and still is, the stereotype of Asian and Asian Americans are that they're the model minority. Why would they be out in the streets walking around?
There were 20,000 women out.
Yeah,
It's
20,000 women.
I was just talking to Muz Chishti, who was a lawyer with the ILG, and he worked closely with Jay Mazer, who was the leader of the ILG, and they got to Mulberry Park that
Columbus
morning.
Park.
Columbus Park, yeah. And people weren't there yet, and they were very worried that no one was going to show up. And then, of course, all these women came. But like the fact that wasn't covered, to your question, like sometimes the media can help, but if the media is not paying attention or it doesn't deem something important, then that's problematic as well. WNYC is always very important.
Yes, that's right.
Of course.
We're going to go for a question right here.
Thank you. I am of Puerto Rican ancestry, and my mother was a member of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. I remember going to the office on 14th Street with her when I was a little girl and seeing also some of her coworkers marching around in front of their factories because they wanted to organize. So I wanted to just hear what anyone has to say about, because we kind of skipped over that population, that population.
Absolutely.
No, incredibly important. And if you come, we tell the story of Ramonita Saez, who comes in the early 1950s with her two little boys, a single woman, and she works as a union member for 30 years and works in a garment shop on the Lower East Side. And she, to her death, carried her union cards. They were so important to her. And her sons talk about, that this card was like, it was health insurance, it was the benefits, but it was also the kind of pride of having been part of the union. So the Puerto Rican women in the garment shops in the 50s and 60s and 70s, formative, incredibly important.
And I think by the 30s and 40s, Puerto Rican and other Caribbean women, Afro-Caribbean women, were the majority of workers before the rise of the Chinatown garment industry.
I think 40s, 50s, and 60s mostly.
Yeah.
You see a lot of Puerto Rican women. And the Chinese actually, I think, work with some Puerto Rican women uptown here not uptown, we're downtown. Uptown in the Midtown garment industry as well. very strong.
There's a wonderful new book by Amy Loisel called Beyond Norma Ray, which tells the story of the Puerto Rican garment workers and their relationship, interestingly, with the dying southern mill towns in the 1950s and 60s, 70s.
And I just want to note, just because of where we're located, right around the corner on Charleston Street, one of the victims of the fire was a woman named, I think, Daisy Lopez Fitz, who was West Indian. So just to, again, most of the women at the time were Jewish and Italian, but there is this Caribbean woman who was in that factory fire, again, just living, right around the corner.
I have some questions in the back. I'll come right here.
Speaking of social cohesion and lack thereof, I am quite surprised that so much of the political left is suddenly being labeled as elite or snooty or intellectual and have lost much of the working class. Where do we go with this? Does anyone have an idea?
It's a great question.
We're seeing a resurgence of the labor movement, and I think that's really really important. In the last couple of years, I mean, it's going to take a hit now because Jennifer Abruzzo, who was Biden's National Labor Relations Board chief, made a lot of decisions that were favorable to workers trying to unionize. But I think not everybody buys that. Obviously, that's the right-wing argument. But there were something like 3 or 4 times, or many more times, the number of approaches to the National Labor Relations Board last year than the year before, and it grew exponentially in the year before that. So what this presidency is going to do to this resurgence of the labor movement, I don't know. Certainly, a lot of it is on campuses, too. The campus labor movement is very, very profound and radical, and I think there'll be a lot of repression. But the good news is not everybody buys that political rhetoric.
Well, and I think also, even beyond the labor movement, having politicians pay attention to class is probably incredibly important. And then I would just throw in, because of where we stand, education, I think, is so important. Educating people about history and our connections. I think history is an important binder for social cohesion, too.
Yeah, there's a reason why they don't want many kinds of histories to be taught.
Right, exactly, and that's why they're erasing certain pages, and they want to get rid of Department of Education, K through 12, and they want to get rid of universities. So those are the,
And to your point, Annelise, we on this station have covered Amazon's unionization efforts, Starbucks, Trader Joe's. I mean, these are hyper-local stories for us. And as we were digging into the research for this panel tonight, what was really sort of heartening is to see this echo of pretty young people spearheading these movements against these monoliths, just massive companies. And yeah, I think I look at, we've interviewed some of them on the Brian Lehrer show and elsewhere, and you're just like, you're 21, like you probably, how do you even know what a union is? And it's just, it's pretty heartening, I will say. I think I saw another question over here, but it's okay if you change your mind. We have time.
Last one, it's a lot of pressure. Thank you so much, really enjoyed the panel today. Just kind of a little bit specific and kind of a narrow question is, I've heard stories of my great-grandmother coming in as a Jewish immigrant, and she used to tell stories about she was hidden under the table because she was underage. And, I went shopping today and, all these things, and you hear they're children, right? And I'm just curious as to what came out of in terms of child labor. I heard about like the bagel union or something and how that was child labor or something. So just curious about child labor laws and how they kind of came out of this.
And thank you for talking. The talking is an art project that started with Ruth Sergal that now the Tenement Museum is organizing, and a big shout out to Kat Lloyd. Is she in the room for organizing it as well? But the idea behind this is to go to the locations where people lived, victims of the fire lived, and chalk their names, so to kind of remember their names and get people, involved. But with regard to child labor laws, that was a big part of the Factory Investigation Commission, and they were looking at, children working in candy factories who were like peeling nuts over hot vats of syrup, and creating legislation to protect children came out. That was also one aspect of the Factory Investigation Commission.
Triangle had a section they called the kindergarten, where workers as young as 5 worked, because their little fingers could strip the threads and do some of the finishing work, and they would hide in barrels of cloth. That's back, right? I mean, a number of car makers have been found to be using children as young as 11 and 12 in factories in the South. In the tobacco fields, it's particularly bad. And again, among the things that are under threat, the GOP Congress right now is attempting to loosen restrictions on child labor. So nothing of the welfare state we take for granted is assured.
Yeah, and in the Chinese factories, the own Chinese factories, the kids were in there because a lot of the women didn't have daycare. So one outcome of the 1982 strike was they built a daycare center down in Chinatown. But before that, and there aren't enough seats for every child of a parent who works in the garment factory. So the kids would come in, and oftentimes they would play in a corner, or the factory owner would have their own kids in there, especially on days off, on vacation days, and the kids would play. And hopefully none of them were working, but some of them sometimes, pulled thread off of cloth, off of whole garments, working, helping their mom out, doing things that were supposedly, safe. But you'll find that at that time. And even when I went to interview the garment workers in the 1990s, I still saw children in there, even with the labor laws.
That is all the time we have for this evening. Please join me in thanking our guests. I will add that Annelise Orleck, her book Common Sense and a Little Fire, and Margaret Chin's book Sewing Women are available in the lobby. So check those out. And they're signed. Yeah. And thank you all so very much for being here and your continued support of our station and of the Tenement Museum. It means so much to us. Have a good evening.